from this moment, we try to speak English, which will be more difficult for me and more easier for our distinguished guests. We have unfortunately limited time, therefore just a very short introduction of our advisors, so to say, because yesterday we had already the occasion to have a dinner with them, and we know that they are not only experts, but they are advisors. They will tell us what Central Europe should do to get more understanding in Washington. Mike Gonzalez is senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and what I want to emphasize is that he is a specialist in national security, which is for Hungary currently very important. He is also a specialist of Mr. Soros. Therefore, he will tell us some interesting details, and he not just started to talk about Mr. Soros 2 years ago, but probably much more time. Mr. Bugajski is senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. He is also a specialist of Central Europe and Hungary. My evidence for this is that we just asked him yesterday whether we could give him a visitation to the Parliament building, and he said that actually he visited already the building many times, first 1992, and his guide was Mr. Orban.
Well, not guide.
Okay, you met Mr. Orban, so you can see that Mr. Bugajski is really a specialist of the region, and therefore we are very happy to welcome our guest from the United States. My first question would be about your impressions on this survey. I would like to ask you whether there is any surprise for you in the numbers, or it is what you thought that a survey would show. You could see that Central Europe is very keen on strengthening relationship with the US, and therefore my question, what is your impression? What is the way and the perspective of America in the region? Especially I would like to ask you about Mr. Trump, whether his image problem, because we can talk about an image problem, is based on the media, or it is based on the lack of interest related to this region, because we think that Mr. Trump is not so active in the region as Central Europe thought earlier after the presidential election. You have the floor.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah.
We share the microphone.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. We just arrived yesterday from Washington, so be patient. We may be a bit slow. Well, I think these are fake polls. No, I'm joking. I'm just mimicking our president. But
don't take all my jokes.
Well, let's put it this way. That's what he says when he doesn't like the news. I'm not surprised by President Trump's negative ratings. And I think they're more than an image problem or a media product. You know, having been involved in one way or another in European politics for many years, there is an unfortunate stereotype of the ugly American. And for a lot of people, I think he fits the bill. In other words, he's not very articulate, he's very brash, he sounds arrogant, he sounds potentially dangerous to Europeans. So I think it feeds into that sort of anti-Americanism throughout Europe, which is both, I would say, on the left, but also on the nationalist right. So he hasn't helped that, let's put it that way. I would like to know, and again, I would have to look more closely at the polling, but to distinguish the question of anti-president and anti-Americanism. Because if it's simply criticism of the president, as you said, whether because he hasn't been involved, because of his image and so forth, that's one thing. But if it's actually furthering anti-Americanism, that's much more corrosive for the transatlantic alliance, and there I'd be much more worried. So to answer your question, I'm not really surprised. I think it's more than I mean, the media clearly contributes to it, and I think he's not going to win the public relations exercise. Let's put it that way. He may actually be a very successful president. And I remember Ronald Reagan wasn't very popular in Europe. when he was elected. There was all sorts of stereotypes about Reagan. He proved to be probably one of the best presidents we've had since World War II. So I'd leave it there. I don't know, I have some comments, maybe over to Mike on this, but some comments about US policy. But I'll follow Mike.
Well, the problem with following Janusz is that you have nothing left to say after he speaks. But I want to thank Nézőpont for inviting us here, and this is a great poll. And I want to thank all of you for showing up. This is a beautiful city. There's a lot of things you could be doing. I guess the only thing that surprised me is what the heck have we done to Slovenia? That was a bit of an outlier. I think as Janusz and I were pointing out earlier, we do have a famous Slovenian American who lives in the White House. We thought that might have improved relations. Look, and the U.S. is not very popular in Austria. No surprise there. Austria and Slovenia, I guess, are more Western European in that sense. As for Trump, as Janusz said, it is a confluence of events and phenomena. He doesn't help, right? I mean, he's very unpredictable, which people don't like. People don't like unpredictability, and he tweets a lot. And he would say, well, he won the election because he tweets a lot. He's discovered this new medium to connect with the voters. But I think it clangs a little bit sometimes. He says things that are shocking to foreign policy communities. But there's the undeniable media question, which I think Janusz alluded to. When Mr. Trump started and we started first meeting with Europeans, we said this to them. We said, you get your understanding of the U.S. from your media, and your media gets its understanding of the U.S. from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, and other elite media outlets. And I don't say elite in a pejorative sense. Sometimes I do. And I think they get Mr. Trump wrong a lot. I was just on a plane yesterday coming from Washington, and somebody was talking about how Mr. Trump dumped the food into the Japanese pond with the fish. The media jumped all over that. In fact, Mr. Trump was just following what Prime Minister Abe had done. He followed his practice. And I think the media does itself no favors when it traduces Mr. Trump. So one thing that I've noticed, and I was a former journalist, I was based here in Europe for 6 years with the Wall Street Journal, and one thing that is different with Mr. Trump is that the media now says that he lies. They use that word, that he lied, and I have never seen this before, and this was an editorial decision that the New York Times made and that the Washington Post made. My old newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, decided we're not going to say ever that Mr. Trump lied, because we don't know. We don't have divine powers to look into his heart. And lying means that he intended to say an untruth. I probably have said many untruths in my life. I don't purposely lie. So I think this is one example of how the media is getting Mr. Trump wrong. And there is some negative stuff to talk about, obviously, but there's also a lot of positive stuff. In my former life in the Wall Street Journal, I covered the stock market. And I would have to write a daily column about what makes stocks rise, what makes stocks fall. The reality is that the stock market has risen 20% since Mr. Trump got elected. If you look at the S&P 500, it plateaus until November 8th. Everybody was expecting Hillary to win, and then all of a sudden it takes off, and it's added over $1 trillion worth of value. Investors, unlike journalists, are putting their money where reality is. And there's a lot of good stuff also that is happening on the ground. There's a lot of deregulation. There's a lot, Mr. Trump is, on the foreign policy front, is doing a lot of right things, I think. The problem is when it comes to the region. And I think there's a problem we have discussed. Maybe we can discuss it a little more at length later. Unfortunately, Central Europe and Hungary are falling through the cracks a little bit because there's been a dearth of appointments in high-level positions in the State Department. You have diplomats, career diplomats running foreign policy in many parts of the world. Now, these career diplomats are good Americans. They're not bad people, but they do skew left. They are not there to promote the policies that Mr. Trump was elected to carry out. And I think when it comes to Hungary, this has been the case in that even when we have had appointments of late, these political appointees have come under the influence of the career people. At this point, I think we're going to pivot. Maybe I am being Pollyannish, and this is what I hope, but I think we will pivot. I'm going to leave it there, and so not to take too much time. You want?
Thank you. We can just suggest the Hungarian system for the United States. We have a much more effective one in case of the appointees. But this was just a joke. Mr. Bugajski, you told us to tell some.
Yeah, I want to actually following up from what Mike said. This is what I prepared, my few comments. The way I see it, US policy towards Europe involves three paradoxes under this administration. And to be specific, paradox over NATO, paradox over Russia, and a paradox over the institutional future of Europe itself. So the NATO paradox, which I think is becoming more clear, more resolved. If you remember during the election campaign, candidate Trump was critical of NATO. At one point he called it obsolete. He seemed to threaten cutting spending US support for NATO. But at the same time, what we've seen is since he's been in office, if anything, I would say NATO has become more reinvigorated. A couple of reasons for that. I think one, he did focus attention through his underscoring the spending question, 2% of GDP. It's a little bit more complex than that, but the fact that he talked about capabilities, he talked about resources, I think that refocused NATO attention on the role of NATO. After, I would say, a period of relative hiatus or a period of out-of-area involvement, the focus is now back on Europe and what to do, particularly with Russia. So that's one thing. The second part of it, where the paradox is being resolved, is that I think Trump has a fairly strong national security team, or at least a national security team that's very much committed to the transatlantic alliance. If you look at our Secretary of Defense, our Secretary of State, his national security advisor, and so on. As Mike said, the appointments in State Department are slow. Nevertheless, I think eventually they will happen, and we will have a stronger position in strengthening the alliance. So that paradox, in a way, which I think was misunderstood by a lot of people in Europe, that we would somehow abandon NATO, is now, hopefully, is now fully resolved. The other part of it, of course, is strengthening the enhanced forward presence, which I think has been very important. Obama started late in realizing that Russia was a threat to its neighbors. But finally, after the attack on Ukraine, I think with the commitment to the enhanced forward presence, the troop rotations and so forth, and that's continuing under this administration. In fact, if anything, this administration is allocating more resources to that presence. Okay, secondly, Russia. The paradox over Russia. I mean, Trump continues to avoid answering or criticizing directly Mr. Putin. Whatever skeletons he has in his closet. But I think, on the other hand, both the administration, as I mentioned, National Security Team, but also Congress, are very clear that Russia is a threat to Western interests, that Russia did interfere in the US elections, that Russia continues to interfere in various election processes throughout Europe, that it's a threat to its neighbors, that it occupies Ukrainian and Georgian territory, and that it promotes a separatist secessionist war in the eastern part of the Donbas region of Ukraine. So again, that paradox between Trump's position and the administration congressional position, it's still a little bit in flux because ultimately decisions are made by the president. But I do believe that as more and more, let's say, facts emerge from investigations, particularly the FBI investigations, that we may have, the mood in Washington is very much on guard against Russia. I think, if anything, it's going to get even stronger. Trump himself, and I said this right at the beginning, the more Trump is perceived as being somehow closely linked with Putin, some have said puppet of Putin, which is an exaggeration. But the more he is seen as that, the more I think he may, or his administration may prove that he isn't. In other words, that he's not acting at the behest of Putin. So that's the second one. The third one, very briefly, the third paradox is over Europe itself. We talked a little bit about this last night. I think here it is a question mostly of the free trade question. Unfortunately, during the campaign, candidate Trump did support Brexit. which didn't go down very well, even I would say in the UK or in Europe. Nevertheless, I think that was a lot of the influences of economic nationalists and protectionists around him, some of whom have left the administration but nevertheless still have possibly some influence over him. But there are, let's say on the other hand, strong Atlanticists, free traders, some call them globalists in a negative sense, within the administration, who continue to steer the government in that direction. How this is going to turn out, I don't know. But if one can separate the economic question from the institutional question, that to me would make sense. Again, it's up to the Europeans what they want, what sort of structures they want in Europe, what sort of European Union they want. I don't necessarily think America should be involved in that process. NATO is different. We're a part of NATO. EU is up to the Europeans.
So I think I'll have time later to come back to Vladimir Putin and to the EU, right? So because I want to have a couple of things to say about what Janusz just said. Just the question of NATO, I don't think you have to worry about this anymore. The three positions that Janusz mentioned are filled by military people, Kelly, McMaster's, and Mattis. And I think they were very quick to inform. And Mr. Trump does listen. He does listen. You know, a lot of people say, well, he's a 70-year-old billionaire. He's not a work in progress. Actually, he showed that when it comes to NATO, he did hear his three generals, and the initial problem which had to do with budgeting, which is still a problem, and he's still going to go back to that. But on the question of NATO, I think that we're very supportive of NATO, and I'll come back later to the EU and Putin. I know that you have other questions.
Okay, thanks. My question would be related to the European policy of the United States, because after the Second World War, the United States promoted very much the European integration. And probably you know that there is a huge dispute among the European states and prime ministers, whether they are promoting now much more the United States of Europe model or much more Central European integration. Which is more in favor of the new US administration, the Central European integration or the United States of Europe?
Let me take this question first. I think what I always tell European visitors is, since Truman, every administration has been very supportive of European integration. This is no longer the case. And I can tell you, it's not just Mr. Trump who has an aversion to supranational, transnational decision-making and governance. He likes nation states, and as do I, and does the Heritage Foundation. So I think what we're seeing is, for the first time, people are saying, well, the construction of Europe, and you're right in the sense that the EU is up to the member states, but we can't, as friends, speak our minds. And a lot, I lived in Brussels for close to 6 years, and a lot of the momentum behind the European construct is against the United States, is to create a polar opposite in a multipolar world. I was there under President Clinton and at the beginning of President Bush, and people say, well, we cannot have a world with a sole superpower. Well, the United States has been a very good friend of Europe. Why would Europe complain about the U.S. being a superpower when the United States has been a very benevolent superpower, if you want to put it that way? You know, so I think that for the first time, at the very high levels of the administration, there are people who are saying, hang on, is deeper European integration good for us? I would take issue, for example, with what Janusz just said about Brexit being a phenomenon of protectionism. I think the people that I listen to, for example, Daniel Hannan, one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, are complete globalists. They want free trade. They like a maritime Britain that rules the waves again and trades with India, trades with Australia, does not have to kowtow to Brussels or to the Commission and listen to the Commission. You know, there is a principle that a nation state, a sovereign nation state, should be able to make its own laws and regulations for the very simple principle that you can fire these people. You cannot fire EU commissioners. And believe me, because I live there, they always say, well, what happens when their plan A was not working? They say, well, we have plan B, plan C. Don't worry, Mike. We have plan A through Z. We're going to get this done if we want to. So I think as a country that was behind the Iron Curtain for a very long time, you have an understanding of this. So I think having a Central European entity that, or union, or identity that is a bit of a counterbalance, a supplement to the EU is not a bad thing at all in terms of U.S. national interest, and I hope to return to why later, but I don't want to take up more of Janus's time.
Okay. The point, just to follow up on that, I wasn't making the point that Brexit was a protectionist move, but that protectionists around Trump would support a Brexit. In other words, those that are opposed to free trade. Yeah, I think it's important for the US to support initiatives such as Visegrad and the TSI, the Three Seas Initiative. I don't see those necessarily as a substitute. There certainly shouldn't be a security substitute for NATO. I mean, I'm a very strong proponent of NATO, and I do not see no other organisation should replace, and even European Union's attempts to create some sort of European army, I would criticise. Because it drains resources away from the alliance, it drains resources away from our common bonds. But in terms of the European Union itself, what I'm saying is it's really up to each European country to decide how it wants to interact with others. You may be faced with a situation, and I see with Macron's election and Merkel's re-election, you may have a move towards more of a federal, confederal system in Europe, or multi-speed Europe. And the question is for countries like Hungary and Poland, do you want to be left outside the process or inside the process? And how will you influence that process? You know, I remember in the early days after the fall of communism, for many years, some people did view organizations such as Visegrad with some suspicion. Is this some substitute, something to keep us away from, let's say, regaining our place in the European mainstream? Is this a way of sidelining us? The question now is, it's got more complicated. Does the European Union serve your interests? If so, how? And if so, how should you be integrated in the European Union? That, I think, is to be decided by each country. Not by... Obviously, we have some opinions in America. It's always good to have at least some structure in Europe that prevents national conflicts, because that's been part of the problem in Europe. Now, if NATO is the organisation that can handle that, fine. If the European Union contributes to that, let's say, cooperation, coexistence, fine. But the future of the European Union, that's really up to each country.
I just want to add, and I agree with everything he just said about NATO, we already have a multi-speed Europe. You and Central Europe are growing at 3%, and they're not. They're growing at less than 1%. So I think you don't have really lessons to take from them. You're deregulating, you're dynamic. So we have a multi-speed Europe, you're growing, a lot of West European countries are not.
For us in Central Europe, it was a very important sign that Mr. Trump visited Warsaw earlier than Brussels. Therefore, my very short question, should the Visegrad countries invite Mr. Trump for the next year and to establish a connection between the Visegrad integration and the new Trump administration? Is it possible? Is there any interest from the White House towards the Visegrad cooperation?
Well, absolutely, you should follow this through. We were talking about this last night over dinner. If you can't get the president, get the vice president. We didn't mention a vice president. This is a figure who's very strong Atlanticist, very committed to the alliance, very committed to NATO, and probably understands the region much better than Trump. So if you can't get Trump, get the vice president.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was a very good thing and very symbolic that President Trump went to Warsaw in his first stop in Europe. He gave a very good speech, I thought, in Warsaw, a speech that was very misunderstood. The West Europeans got the message, believe me. We had a round table with ambassadors at Heritage afterward, and one ambassador was very derisive of the fact that he had chosen Poland, and he was sitting next to the Polish ambassador. No, I mean, I think that Mr. Trump and the people around him chose Warsaw for a reason.
I can just tell you that we like very much the speech of Mr. Trump in Warsaw. We had to translate it in some hours to the Hungarian government, which we are working for, because decision makers were very interested in the content of the speech. We should speak honestly also about the threats for this Central European cooperation with the United States. You could see that there is a strong affiliation with the United States in the region. Therefore, my question, which are the dangers for these cooperations? I have some idea for it. First, the influence of Russia. You, Mr. Bugajski, already mentioned the paradox with Russia. And a second could be also Mr. Soros and the role of Mr. Soros, therefore our figures about his popularity in the region.
Let me take that first.
Yeah, let me say, I mean, I haven't studied the whole Soros phenomenon. You have, so why don't you go ahead?
You want
me to go first?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. I do understand the focus on Soros in Hungary, maybe in Romania as well. But as you've noticed, when I'm looking at the polls, there's no name recognition, or barely, in places like Poland. I would have liked to see in the polls opinions about Angela Merkel and about Vladimir Putin, because I think that affects international security much more than George Soros. George Soros may affect domestic politics, because I think that would be indicative of where public opinion stands vis-à-vis America against two of the most important leaders on your continent. Dangers, very briefly. I think actually, I think Mike was hinting at this, it may take a bit of time, but I think this administration may be less fixated on, in the American sense, the liberal agenda in neighbouring, amongst allies in Europe, in Central Europe, particularly in terms of social and cultural policy. I think we see this now in terms of cuts in the State Department, cuts of certain programs. Now, because I often wonder, how would Americans feel if Budapest or Warsaw criticized our president for calling the media the enemy of the people, or encouraging the Justice Department to investigate his political rivals? I could imagine the American political reaction to that, and I can see the sensitivities of people in Hungary and Poland reacting to criticisms of the political systems here. On the other hand, I would say what's very important, and this goes back again to the NATO and the security question, Hungary, Poland, other countries can't have it both ways. If you want to defend your national sovereignty, then you have to demonstrate that you are serious in defending your national security, which means defending yours and your neighbors, and particularly your allies' security. In other words, that you do not expect America to carry most of the burden for your defense, for your security, which is a point, I think, rightly so, that Trump was making during the elections. This is, I think, more likely how you will be judged by this administration, rather than by your internal political makeup.
Let me address this from the perspective of your diplomacy and less so from popular opinion. I'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think in the case of migration, refugees need global attention. They're leaving traumatized, chaotic situations. Whether the help is to bring them to our country, so to help them there, that's another thing, and you have to see who's a true refugee. But on the question of migration, I know that Hungarians don't like it when I say this. You've won. You won the philosophical argument, you won the political argument. Mrs. Merkel has lost the philosophical argument. And that we can see in the result of elections here and in Germany itself, and in the Czech Republic and Austria and so forth, and the popularity of the Polish government. When it comes to Mr. Soros, I think this is the right fight for you. I think that it opens doors for you in Washington, in the sense that there are a lot of people in Washington who understand Mr. Soros, and it's not just a Hungarian issue, it's a global issue. Now, I don't personally know Mr. Soros. He does some things that I support around the world. We live in a nuanced world. He does pursue a lot of policies that I oppose, that are very liberal and lead ultimately, I think, to social chaos. So I think when you come and speak about Mr. Soros and take a strong stand against Mr. Soros in Washington, it closes some doors. There are some people who say, well, when you are anti-Soros, you're pro-Putin. So you have to make that case that one does not equal the other. But it will open some doors for you in Washington, because people get it. We hear this from other countries in the world, in Latin America, across Europe. He's very involved, and he's got a lot of money, and he uses his money to promote policies. I'm sure he doesn't mean to do evil. Nobody, as Sartre said, the tragedy is that everybody has his reasons. And Mr. Soros has his reasons. I think we have a view of the world, and your government has a view of the world that is different from Mr. Soros. To get to the bad, I think Vladimir Putin, and I think already we have spoken about this, that closes doors for you. closest doors for Hungary in the United States, in Washington. If you're seen as being somebody who front for Vladimir Putin, that is going to close many more doors than it will open. In fact, it's going to open 0 doors for you in Washington at this point. We see Mr. Putin as an adversary. As Janusz said before, every American president that has come in has wanted to have a reset. With Mr. Putin, Clinton tried it. The president I served, George W. Bush, tried it. Obama tried it. And Mr. Trump, we're seeing that right now. It has tried it at first, and it just never works. It never works to have a reset with Mr. Putin. He's an adversary of the West. He's an adversary of our values. So to the degree that your government is seen as being supportive of Mr. Putin, it is a net negative, and hugely so, I believe.
Related to the defense budget, you have to know that all the countries of the Central European regions are very much interested and keen on increasing the budget. Hungary itself has a program for 10 years, and after 10 years we would like to reach more than 2% of the GDP ratio. At the very beginning I mentioned that you are not just very good analysts but also advisors, and therefore my question, what is your advice for us in Central Europe? What should be done in order to get more eco in Washington and to establish again the beautiful friendship between the region and the US, as it used to be the case in the 90s and probably at the very beginning of the the millennia?
I think you have more to say about this, so let me go first.
Look, this is a very dynamic region. America likes dynamism. America likes economic growth. And to the degree that you can go to Washington and say, we're much more dynamic than the industrialized economies of France, Belgium, and so forth, I think you can get people's attention. You also get people's attention. America likes good allies. You're very good allies. Hungary, for example, has troops, I believe, in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. And to the degree that you can make this case for you, it will go a very long way. That's all I have.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot to add. I mean, look, we're not going to return back to the good old days of the 1990s. That's a new nostalgia in a way, but those days are gone. Question is, what do you do now? What can you do now to get American attention, to help American policy, to help America defend itself and defend the alliance? As you mentioned, it's not just spending, it's capabilities, it's involvement, it's diplomacy, it's troop presence, it's contribution in your niches, what you're good at. I think that's extremely important. And unfortunately, a country like Hungary did fall behind. Czech Republic and Slovakia also. Unlike the Baltic states, well, some of the Baltic states did also, if you look at Latvia. But look at Estonians, you look at the Poles, you look at the Romanians. I think those countries do get more attention in Washington because they do contribute more in that sense to the alliance. But you have to also come up with some new ideas, new initiatives that would be attractive for Washington, that would make people pay attention. I mean, you are a small or a medium-sized country in Central Europe, but you can play a role in the region, in regional security. You can play a role for America. One of the focuses for American foreign policy is countering, for example, jihadism, Islamic extremism. That's something you can help to contribute to. Come up with some creative ways in which you can monitor this, in which you can combat this. Investment. Make yourself more open to US investment. Mike mentioned the whole economic sphere, which is extremely important. If you can open the country to more US firms or trade with the United States, whether bilaterally but also in a regional setting, I think that all contributes. Part of it is also combating the negatives. The perception of Hungary, as Mike mentioned, as somehow Mr. Orban is pro-Putin, which I think is over the top, but that's the way it is presented because of some of the things that the government has done. The best example here, I think, is over the Ukrainian question. And this is very unfortunate, but I remember after the attack on Ukraine by Russia, which was a direct attack on an independent country that took away some of its territory. Unfortunately, I don't recall that Budapest was as outspoken as Warsaw or Vilnius or Tallinn or Bucharest about the attack. I think, I'm not saying in any way that Hungary would support what Russia did in Ukraine. I think you need to be more diplomatically outspoken. I think you need to demonstrate that in Washington, that you are not tied to Putin. There may be some economic connections, but look, let's face it, Germany has economic connections, gas connections. Unfortunately, this Nord Stream 2, which is now being developed with Russia. But you know, supporting strongly sanctions, supporting Ukrainian territorial integrity, supporting your neighbors that feel more threatened by Russia. Poland, for example, Hungary's best partner probably in Central Europe, feels very threatened by Russia. So if Hungary can show that it's part of the, let's say, support base for a secure and independent Central Europe, that means it's a bastion against Russian negative subversion.
In case of the Ukraine, you have to know that there is a Hungarian minority, and those rights Hungary tries to defend very much.
There's also a Polish minority in Galicia, and Poland does defend the rights, but does not appear to be, let's say, undermining Ukrainian territorial integrity like Hungary appears to be.
On the other hand, there is a good connection to the Ukraine, a strategic partnership between Hungary and the Ukraine. Back to your message that we should open our doors for the investments, I have to tell you that our doors are already very open, and there is already a competition among the Central European countries for more investment from the US, for example. Therefore, a final question. What should be done to attract more investment, not just in the sense to open the door, but to strengthen the interest of the United States into the region? Because we are afraid that people are talking nice messages that you are good guys, but they are not so much interested in the region, in the success of this region, as it comes to financial investments or business interests.
Well, I mean, you're limited by the fact that you're a member of the EU, and that is, you know, everything ends up being...
sorry, and we would like to be a member of the EU.
Right, but you have to sign up to all the bad stuff that the EU passes in terms of regulation and in terms of what you can do and cannot do, and American companies, you know, very limited. One of the reasons why President Trump doesn't really like Brussels, doesn't really like the EU, is because he thinks as a businessman, he remembers the time when he wanted to open golf courses in Ireland and the UK, and how it was EU regulations that prevented him from doing so, doing what he wanted. So he hasn't forgotten this. So, but I mean, look, you're very dynamic, as I said. You know, you can have trade delegations to the United States, not just to Washington, because there's very little done in Washington. There is a regulatory aspect, but we're deregulating a lot. But, you know, go speak to companies, and I show you where exactly in a company's production line Hungary would fit.
Just a buzzword, Nabucco pipeline, for example, which was...
Well, actually, I was going to say on the energy side, I think you need to revisit that much more closely. You have to, let's say, greatly reduce your dependence on Russia, particularly Russian gas. And I think some of these interconnectors, alternative energies, but also American shale gas. Or, you know, through, for example, Poland is now importing LNG through its terminal in Świnoujście. Look more closely at the Świnoujście-Kirk corridor that's being planned. I know the Croats have some problems with Kirk. The Russians are trying to meddle to buy up Croatian energy companies. But that's something I think that Hungary can play a role, to strengthen Central Europe by strengthening its energy diversity and linking that more closely with the United States.
Thank you very much. The message from this panel discussion for me was that the future will be even better than the current situation, and the friendship between the US and the region could be strengthened. Thank you very much for the analysis and the advices we got.
Thank you, and thank you.